there's really an emotional component to inheriting or being responsible for an artist's estate, and it's fraught. Oftentimes, what I hear, we're getting calls more and more, baby boomers are going. This is an area of study, actually. The nature of the artist's studio post-war, how artists produced, what they produced, the quantity that they produced, how we perceived the artist's studio. All of this is just sort of emerging as an idea. But it really oftentimes people are, when I get calls or when I deal with this, they're confused, first of all. There's guilt, very common. Someone's passed away, and there's a sort of an expectation that you're going to be responsible for their work. And that gets into a whole other issue of what are the artist's responsibilities? Should we expect artists should we expect that artists are going to be cataloging their own work, making their intentions clear? Is that the role of the artist? For some, certainly, professional artists, they're really clear that they can handle the business side of things. Or they hire people to handle the business side when they're alive. So it's incredibly emotional. There's also frustration and anger. Why didn't you do this before you died? Why didn't you make it clear what we were supposed to do with all your crap? What were your priorities? Didn't you care about your work enough? How dare you put this on me? So there's these incredible emotional components. And people try to sort of approach it from a business standpoint. We have business people coming in on this and saying, I can handle this as inventory and that kind of thing. And we have people coming in from a completely emotional perspective. I've gotten calls where people have said, we're bringing a dumpster in. Literally, we're bringing in garbage cans, we're going to throw it all away. So this is an issue that's emerging and it needs to be addressed. The gallery is going to try to fill a gap until we can give it over to the public. We're going to produce a PDF, kind of a step-by-step thing that'll be available on the website. People who couldn't come today asked that we video document it, so we're going to make that freely available as well. I contacted the Pittsburgh Arts Foundation and the Joan Mitchell Foundation, and thank you, Lynn, for lending these from Barbara Crane's estate. They're two great documents. Next week, we've got rights to put these both available as PDFs, full PDFs on the gallery's website, and we'll be excerpting the artist's checklist as well. There's something about these that is distinctive. They approach the collection as someone who has money and somebody whose work is well collected, So we have a lot of cases where that's not true. So we're going to try to work it through with people. It'll be a concise guide, and it'll be available to everyone. So with that, I want to introduce, I want to talk a little bit about John Miller and his show here, because it's also an example of a situation. So John Miller was married to Barbara Crane. They shared studios. John is very comfortable. He's in care in Milwaukee with Alzheimer's, probably mid-stage Alzheimer's. Barbara died in August of last year. So the disposition of their studios is now in the ether, basically. Finding ways to get it out there, figuring out what the next steps are. What I'm doing is the primary assessment. First, we removed environmental issues. The first thing that you do when you go into an artist studio is you remove any kind of mold issues or chemical issues. You take care of yourself first. You photograph and document everything that you can, every perspective of the studio, and then you dig in. And so this is John's studio. Actually, after it's been cleaned up quite a bit, you'll see these tables with plastic over them. There was a leak in the studio. There were some damages. And then This should go on.
Looks
There we go.
organized.
So this is a table with these prints. There are about, I would say altogether, Lynn, it's about this tall of these large scale prints. My estimate right now is there was around 2,000 to 3,000 of these prints. This is an example of an inventory. I'm going to make this available on the website as well. It's a basic Excel spreadsheet that's attached to photography through these accession numbers.
And, excuse me, you did that.
Yeah, right. So I'm photographing every piece, and it has a code number. There's a lot of different ways to do this. There are expensive softwares, gallery software to do cataloging. And actually, that's one of the next steps. If the community is interested, I will do basic cataloging training here in the gallery. I'll do kind of events that show people to demystify it, because it's really an important step. It's my honor to introduce one of my favorite people in the world, actually. David Sokol he's a mensch, I'm telling you. He's another person like Lynn Brown who just really tries to connect people. I met David now almost 15 years ago when I took on a job as executive director at a Frank Lloyd Wright site in Oak Park, Unity Temple Restoration Foundation. And it was fraught with issues. And David came in and strolled in the second week, and he just said, it's gonna be okay, and here are your resources. I have an unpublished manuscript on the history of the development of the building. I'd love to give that to the foundation, if you can do anything with it. And we did, and it continues to do well. But he's been there continuously. He's just an incredible person in the community. He is Professor Emeritus of American Art, Modern Art, and Museology from long time from the University of Illinois at Chicago. He was the first curator and later was the acting director at both the Terra Museum of American Art and the Spertus Museum. He retired full-time from teaching at UIC, and in the past few years, he's been working in the Oak Park Historic Preservation Commission, I think the board of Hull House. He's guest curated there. He's guest curated everywhere. He's constantly working on exhibitions, including Jay Boersma's upcoming show. Where's Jay? There's Jay, the photographer. And with that, David Sokol.
When we started talking about this, I mentioned I had given this paper at a conference of the American and Pop Culture Associations, probably about 15 years ago. And bluntly, I was going to say it was still relevant. No, it's more relevant now in terms of what he's pointed out, as the whole art world has changed, as certain explosions. But before I actually start reading it, I can honestly say there has seldom been a 6-month period in the last 20 years where I have not gotten at least one call or letter from someone saying, I have this collection. It was either my husband's, my uncle's, my aunt's, my mother's, my father's, my whatever. And there's hundreds of people, and it's really good. And I hope you thought you might have a graduate student who'd like to do a thesis on the work. And I say to myself, no, you would like someone to do a free catalog for you of this work. They have no thesis on something they don't know anything about. There's a meaning to thesis, but they're looking for labor. They're overwhelmed. So that's sort of a background that Keith has already referenced, and I see a lot of nodding of heads. And it's easy to be overwhelmed when you're in that position. So I'm going to just read this off. And I called it The Inherited Collection, Blessing and/or Curse. It is a truism of the museum world that all gifts eat, by which it is meant that any gift to the museum must be inventoried, cataloged, stored, insured, conserved, and researched. Each of those actions has a financial cost, and it costs quite a bit to do each step correctly. The same is true to a very large extent for privately owned collections. Of course, some types of objects need less security, care, or cost to preserve than others. Original art, especially one-of-a-kind paintings, collages, and any works on paper, require the most care and are the most susceptible to damage and loss, and some of the most widely collected objects of art. On the other hand, sculpture, crafts, and the so-called decorative arts are usually easier to care for in terms of lack of those light conditions relating to light particularly, yet take up much more room, are heavier, more fragile, and have greater costs associated with shipping and handling. And the larger the collection, the more costs of storage, conservation, etc., and they tend to multiply rather than merely increasing. Excuse me. It is easy for a collector who has purchased each object to have some idea as to the implications of building a collection, and he, she, or they usually have the intention, but not always, excuse me, the means and ability to both care for the collection and make appropriate plans for its distribution or its future in an institutional setting. There are obviously many collectors who live for the day and either put off planning for the future of their collections or who die before putting their plan into action. But those have some concern with either of the future of the collection as a whole or about their own immortality through the collections often do make arrangements. Not necessarily near the time the collector starts purchasing work, but usually well before the end of her or his or their life. Plans are made, or intentions are made known for the future of the collection. Often, all of a collection, or a significant part thereof, is earmarked for a museum, an alma mater, or a favorite charity. And go down to this one note. Given the realities of the American system of taxation, collectors with any substantial assets and some level of sophistication plan for the work given to any not-for-profit institutions to be evaluated so as to minimize the tax liability for their heirs, too. Other times, much or all of the collection is going to pass to members of the family, usually children, but often siblings, nieces and nephews, or even grandchildren, and is often no surprise to the heirs or recipients of the collection that they have a lot of work coming at some point in the future. And although there can be complications, like lack of wall space or storage space for the inheritors, who may not have the same scale of home or space for the art, the problem if heirs don't really want the art, but kept their opinions to themselves out of respect to the collecting relatives, the competition between heirs for specific works of art can be severe. The disputes when some heirs want to sell and others want to keep the inheritance is another issue. The conflict between respecting the tastes and unspecified will of the deceased versus the desire to have the largest amount of money for the heirs to divide is another issue. All of these problems and issues can be there when the works of art in a collection are all the production of one individual, when the collection is inherited by an individual or family, and most especially when the art was created by a family member. The problem arises because the inheritor has all the obligations of the conscious, avid collector, all the costs, and some sentimental attachment, often unmatched by even passionate art collectors, yet without the collector's original intent, love of objects, or even necessarily the resources to properly administer and care for the collections. And it is this kind of collection, where an artist member's family involved, that is the locus and focus of this discussion. This is a fairly modern phenomenon, one that can only arise in a society in which the artist is either an amateur or one creating for an open marketplace, as opposed to the traditional artist who created on commission or for a known and limited number of patrons. Indeed, this is primarily a Western phenomenon, and then one that dates to really only about the middle of the 19th century, and the cult of the individual and artist as inspired creator as opposed to craftsman. The first well-documented example of this kind of inherited collection, and I'm sure that there are others earlier, but the very famous one is inherited by the engineer V.W. van Gogh of Haarlem, the nephew of Vincent van Gogh. The artist had only sold one painting in his lifetime, as you may know, and it is possible that his art dealer brother, probable actually, had even bought that one. So the nephew, through his mother until he was of age, inherited quite a collection of what was assumed to be unsaleable paintings. The Van Gogh family was smart, and as soon as the work started selling well, they were very careful not to flood the market. They limited the pool of available work and then sequestered much of the collection into a foundation that was eventually to become the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. Of course, very few artists ever achieved the fame of Van Gogh, even posthumously, and there are significant issues of even dealing with the quantity of work when the lifetime production of an artist falls into the hands of the accidental collector. My thinking about this subject is the result of a number of years at work as a museum curator and administrator, and one who's been asked to evaluate and even appraise such collections in the past. And as a person who taught and directed a museology program at my university, and as one who has been the longtime curator of an accidental collection for the family that inherited it. While there are occasional Van Gogh success stories, all too often, the inheritor of the accidental collection has a large number of works to handle, an insufficient number of relatives and friends to whom they might be distributed, and a great deal of frustration, as Keith has pointed out, as to how to proceed. If the work is really bad to mediocre, mostly the case when the proverbial Sunday painter created a large body of work, it is often both possible and appropriate to advise the inheritor to keep what the immediate family wants, to distribute whatever is possible to the widest extended family and friends, and to seek out other acquaintances, organizations, etc. who might be interested. The unstated reality in pursuing such an approach is that the rest of the work might eventually be destroyed. Two other important variables here are the combination of dedication and aggressiveness of the inheritor on one hand, and the size and means of the broader network available to her or him to whom the work can be distributed. Thus, an inheritor with a large and at least middle-class family and involvement in various aspects of civic life is more likely to find a home for a much larger amount of the work than someone from a small and our lower income family. Just a reality. There are other variables that make it more difficult for both the inheritors of a collection and the professionals they consult about the disposition and deposition of the collection. These come into play when the work is either good but not very marketable, when there are changes in style that don't make the work readily identifiable as that of the same artist, or when there is so large a body of work that is particularly hard to market, or a combination of the above. Thus, the owners of inherited collections often have a great deal of difficulty in selling or even giving away the art, even if the artist was competent and even somewhat commercially successful. I shall now turn to three brief case studies of such inherited collections to explore some of the already mentioned issues in a more concrete way. Two of the cases are ones I had a direct relationship to the work, and the third is based on an even more direct experience of a professional colleague. Number one, the first case combines two significant variables. The artist was long dead and unknown, and the small body of work inherited were beautifully and extremely well done drawings, but were nonetheless academic drawings without a ready or obvious market. The works in question were a modest collection of drawings by the young American artist Henry Fewsmith, 1821 to 1846, who died at the early age of 25, very soon after having completed his studies in the Academy in the company of Emanuel Leutze and others at the famous academy in Dusseldorf, Germany in 1846. I had first encountered the work of Hugh Smith when I visited the collector who had acquired most of the small production of this artist while I was pursuing my own thesis research on the 19th century American painter John Kedar. This collector, Charles Hoffman, of Elizabeth, New Jersey, had set himself the task of collecting both the art and documentation of all earlier artists who had lived or died in New Jersey, and was a tremendous resource and font of knowledge about hundreds of artists with ties to the tiny, excuse me, but strategically situated state that bordered on both New York City and Philadelphia. A passionate but eccentric collector, Hoffman lived alone in a small house packed with art, keeping the heat turned off, if not way down in the winter, so as not to waste money that he could use otherwise buying art. He also bought tons and tons of pillowcases because he could put small paintings in those. That was his storage system. He had substantial written records about his findings and was generous enough in sharing what he knew about New Jersey artists. I found references to him in the files of Jack Bauer, the director of the Whitney Museum, and others who all visited Charlie. But only some of his breathtaking array of facts were committed to paper, and a lot of valuable and perhaps irretrievable data was lost with his death. Hoffman's collection was dispersed when he died, with much of it going to various museums. Several wrote his acquired work too, and a group of drawings by Hugh Smith came into the possession of a nephew who had migrated to the Chicago area. By the most casual of coincidences, thank you, my wife and I were at a local party in Oak Park, and I was introduced to the nephew, John. We got into a conversation. It turned out he had been born in Elizabeth, New Jersey. I laughingly said that I only knew one person there 20 years early and told him that he was an art collector named Charles Hoffman. John then informed me that his Uncle Charlie was the man I had earlier known. I visited him in the nephew's apartment, and I found he had a closet filled with Hugh Smith drawings. The nephew was very fond of his uncle and had a reasonable enjoyment of art, but the combination of living in a 3-bedroom apartment with a family that included 2 young children, the fact that the works were large drawings and that they were anatomically correct nudes of both sexes, made him less than eager to display them among his children and his children's friends. He then moved elsewhere, and I talked in the Chicago area, and I talked about the work from time to time. And he was at a loss as what he could do with so many large framed academic studies. At one time, I suggested he might like to donate some of the drawings to appropriate museums, and he decided to do that when he was ready to move to his new home. He brought several of the works to my home, gave me one because of the historical tie to Charlie Hoffman, and I took on the responsibility of placing them in collections in which they made sense. And one of them went to the print and drawing room at the Art Institute of Chicago. And although the works are of high quality, of substantial scholarly appeal, the very fact that they are primarily academic exercises and can bear limited exposure to light severely limits the amount of time they can ever be on display and the types of institutions that would want and could care for them. Number 2, the second case, in one which the important variables are a very large body of work by a highly skilled artist, a long career in which the artist constantly changed and refined his style, though retaining a strong commitment to the human form and space. In addition, the fact that the combination of financial independence at certain times in his career and the hiatus created by the Nazi era created a less visible career and set of dealer relations that were hard to reestablish after the artist's death. Finally, the artist had a most unusual approach to creating his graphic work, making marketing extremely difficult. This case concerns the estate of Otto Neumann, 1895 to 1975, some of the work of which you can see back here after we're finished. He was a German painter and graphic artist whose wife and daughter had predeceased him. and whose large oeuvre was inherited by his wife's 3 nephews, are all living in various parts of the United States. Soon after the artist's death in a suburb of Munich in 1975, the family hired a local German architect to catalog the large number of works found in the artist's studio before shipping the entire collection to the home of one of the nephews, then living in Highland Park. The architect seems to have gotten the chronology correct when stamping the work with an estate stamp and a 6-digit number, but his work was erratic, and whole portfolios, which contain hundreds of monotypes, woodcuts, and drawings, were left unnumbered. Again, our host, Keith, has shown Neumann and continues to work with the estate. The unusual feature that complicated the marketing and dispersal of the collection was one that had implications for any sales even in his lifetime. Whether creating a woodcut or an Aldian print, and Neumann created hundreds of each, and even while retaining the block from each was printed, the artist only pulled 1 image of each. There were no additions. Occasionally, he would reuse the same plate or block, changing the color of the image, adding highlights, or using different types of paper. He then signed and dated each work individually, and thus, again, they are all one of a kind, no additions. Thus, this and the family who owned the work was it was very hard to influence and get dealers interested in the work because of that. I later learned, excuse me, that one of the 3 nephews who visited the artist in Germany in the 1960s and had interested a few collectors' museums in the work before the artist's death. But for a variety of reasons, most of the work was still in his studio. After Neumann died and his estate was brought to this country, the nephew with the work in his possession tried to interest a major Chicago dealer in German expressionist prints in the collection. She, however, wanted to cherry-pick the expressionist pieces of the late teens and early 20s, and the nephew wisely declined to break up the estate in that way. In other ways, they finally started to pursue things, and eventually I became the curator of that estate in the 1980s. So, one of the things we found is difficult when you have a body of prints like that, and even with people who wanted to do the right thing, the first step in dealing with this collection of this magnitude was to do a total inventory of the work, which was done, and it was insured, and several exhibitions were shown, both in this country and in Germany. Several hundred works had been sold, and others were donated to museums at a certain point. As mentioned above, though, and since the work was comparatively unknown in this country, the largest percentage of the estate being one-of-a-kind prints, this created a problem. In that regard, I'll give 2 examples of how issues were raised by prospective dealers over the years. There are only a handful of oil paintings, particularly portraits done between 1919 and 1925, and they are expressionist pieces influenced by the work of Oskar Kokoschka and others in his circle. I had a major New York dealer in paintings examine those portraits in my home before the first retrospective had been shown. He was very interested in them. However, I pointed out some of the other prints and so forth. He barely glanced at them and admitted he was only interested in the paintings. He was disappointed when I explained that the artist had abandoned painting in oils in the early 1920s and essentially gave up on watercolor work in the mid-30s. He didn't see any interest in dealing in any of the paintings beyond that early stuff, any of the work beyond that stuff. Some years later, I happened to have a major dealer from Paris looking at things. He immediately zeroed on certain prints of the 1950s and early 60s, some of which are here. His first question to me is, what was the size of the edition for these works? When I explained how the artist didn't pull editions and that each piece was unique, he totally lost interest. I asked for an explanation, and he said, quote, if the work was of someone already famous, a dealer could sell the odd piece with little trouble, unquote. He then explained how dealers like his firm worked They bought an entire edition of a lesser-known artist's work, say 200 pieces that there might be. For the sake of a description, he would then take 50 in Paris, make sure someone in Basel maybe got another 50, another one in New York got another 50, and then they'd have advertising in Art International or some such periodical, and they would be sort of cross-marketing that way. And with the lack of an already established reputation, in spite of his assertion that he thought the work was of real merit, nothing was appropriate in the Neumann collection for his way of marketing, and he could not and would not commit to getting involved. So, things went along, and eventually a variety of dealers got involved, and Keith being one of three. The last of the three of these case studies relates to the estate of Dick Higgins, the American artist who is well known as one of the co-founders of Fluxus in the 1960s, and whose large body of traditional paintings and drawings, mixed media pieces, and conceptual ephemera has been inherited by my departmental colleague, Hannah Higgins, and her twin sister, Jessica Higgins. Higgins died suddenly and while away from home in October of 1998, and his daughters had to deal with the staggering amount of diverse work of his own, the writings about other artists, and some of his other possessions. The artist had been a student of John Cage and Henry Cowell, and he had written and often produced hundreds of recordings of his music and other compositions. And over the 40 years of active, fertile, and various career, he had produced 15 films, had written more than 30 books, and had produced more than 500 prints and about 70 paintings near the end of his life. In addition, Higgins had owned the Something Else Press that specialized in publishing the work of such avant-garde figures as Gertrude Stein, John Cage, Merce Cunningham, Claes Oldenburg, and others, to the tune of another 70 to 75 books. But that wasn't all that was at the artistic portion of the estate. There were 45 file cabinets filled with notes, correspondence with artists, publishers, clients, and records relating to exhibitions and business dealings. Last, but certainly not of inconsiderable importance, was a library of over 10,000 books when Higgins left to his wife, the artist Alison Knowles, all on shelves that he had replaced the pews in a church. Always more interested in the creative process than selling a product, the artist died with a house in upstate New York, a debt of $20,000 and $200 in the bank. Hannah Higgins, who, by the way, I checked with her that it was okay with her the other day for me to go into this, she said, no problem. The artist's daughter is not only an art historian, but had made the career choice to specialize in the work of Fluxus artists, and had actually written her doctoral dissertation on her mommy and daddy, to tell you the truth, which I found interesting, on the importance and the founding of Fluxus. She has continued to work in this area, so the artist was fortunate enough not only having a caring child responsible for the care, preservation, and disposition of his entire life's work, but also someone who is both extremely knowledgeable about it and well connected to those individuals and institutions who might be interested in it. Now here's the big but. Or nevertheless, and in spite of the substantial reputation of the artist and the number of books and articles that had already addressed his importance in the evolving art of the Fluxus world, it was not easy to handle the large body of work in so many media, the complexity of the ephemeral nature of much of it, and the substantial body of papers and documents. As Hannah has put it in her offhand and wry way, quote, I was myself in my 4th year of my tenure line and 7 months pregnant. I broke my right hand in 3 places just after my dad's death, and my mother had to sell his house quickly. There was no money to support the situation, unquote. She is a trained art historian and knew the importance and potential value of much of the work, but the need to settle the estate, to pay off the debts, and the long distance between the material in New York and her residency and both professional and family obligations in Chicago made things very difficult even for her. So we can imagine what it is for people who have less of a connection. Hannah admits what resulted was a frenzied sell-off Not exactly the careful culling of effects that I would have desired, especially since my chosen profession of art historian teaches me otherwise. But this was real life, real death. We were just in the middle of it, and the following spring I made roughly 4 trips east, newborn in tow. End of quotes. There were many diverse tasks involved in closing down the estate, and the family was able to find book dealers who were interested in Higgins' large and wide-ranging library. They had 3 groups of private book dealers in from Europe go through the library. Thus, income was derived that was used to pay off debts. Placing the archives was a very different kind of project, as they had specific appeal to scholars of art history. The estate was visited by representatives of 2 archives, those of the Getty Research Institute and Northwestern University. The Getty wanted a substantial amount of the material, about a third of the items in all, but were neither willing to pay, I guess the Gettys don't have any money left or something like that, for any of the material, nor to commit to the entire archive. Donating the work there would have led to the same problem as selling either just as the oils or the expression pieces of Neumann, in that the whole value of the whole thing would be diminished by breaking it up that way. And part of the importance of the archive was an indicator of the artist's intent, interest and intent. Unwilling to either split the collection or destroy part of it, but unable to store and use it themselves, it was a problem. Fortunately, Don Roberts of Northwestern University wanted the material placed there at his university, so the music library at Northwestern University was able and willing to coordinate with their own special collections department to purchase the papers, recordings, and musical compositions. And as they already owned and maintained the John Cage archive and had purchased the papers of the Something Else Press in '74, they were able to see the value of having so much of this together. After several frantic and nerve-wracking months, Hannah and her family were able to work with a friend of her father's who owned a bookstore in Kingston, New York, to temporarily house the paintings in his cellar. The prints were placed in Higgins' daughter's garage. Neither of those arrangements were ideal or even sound museologically, but the sales to date have been insufficient to pay for all the appropriateness of its care. Much of it has been much improved since then, though. The family works of the project keeps working at it slowly, trying to release one new or old work of Higgins each year, in much the same way as Van Gogh's family meted out the artist's paintings, slowly, and so as to not flood the market and depress the market. At the end of 2002, they had organized a traveling exhibition of the best graphic works and rare books he had published, including paintings, drawings, and films, and that went on for quite a few years on the road. Doing so achieved several purposes: keeping the artist's work before the public, giving exposure to the items that still might be sold, not least of all, having the work insured by the host institutions. They've also released a book of Henry Cowell's writing on music, published by McPherson of Kingston, New York, a project that Higgins had almost completed when he died. They still have plans to do a special compact disc of the music, and hope to also deal with the unpublished autobiography found among the papers. As if to answer to the question posed in the title of this essay, Hannah Higgins has noted, "It has been both a pleasure and a burden, but more the former than the latter. How many children are lucky enough to understand deeply the work of a parent and to develop their legacy from within the discipline that they have chosen for themselves? Still, we do worry about the basement." These are, of course, many other variations of all these stories and cases, but I hope that exploring them, these few, shed some light on the cold reality that even clearly well-executed art by artists of real talent and even vision can be a real mixture of blessing and burden, as the inheriting family struggled to enjoy the work, respect the memories of the artist, and dispose of the work that they cannot handle in a sensitive and appropriate way. Thank you.
Why don't we start from left to right, Doug?
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about this. You've been in calls. How do you go about the process, and we know that the institutions, you guys are extraordinarily busy, and you have limited resources. And Dr. Sokol pointed out the cost.
Mhm.
So do you undergo a cost-benefit analysis, or do you?
No, so just a brief background too, and David, Dr. Sokol was on our board. Are you on the board now? You are on the board now, yes. As a board member of the Illinois State Museum. So the State Museum, which is how the main museum is in Springfield, we have several campuses, more so previously than we have now, deals with Illinois artists. That's our collection, as well as anthropology and natural history, but I'm with the art section. So we have this sort of geographic focus, artists with a significant history in the state. So one of the things that we talk about is, we ask the question, how does this person fit into this social history? We're not necessarily interested in monetary value or, the masterpiece. We want something that is indicative of a time and a place, shows a certain amount of, professional merit, but we also take work by amateur artists as well too, because it also fulfills or fills in a larger story. So in terms of a process, we're a small institution. We wear many hats. I started off as a preparator. I'm now a curator, but I still do preparation. I drive a truck. I change light bulbs. I mop the floor. I also curate exhibitions, and I do a lot of extensive work with the collection. So we are all in all aspects of it. As an institution with a mission of the state, our history of the state, we actually have a fairly loose conversational acquisitions policy. We receive inquiries individually from other families or artists or institutions about our interest in a particular artist's work. And whoever receives that inquiry then goes to our section head, our museum director, and makes a point either, if we kind of are the first line, we'll say, yeah, I think this has merit. Give me as much information I think right now so that I can take it to my boss, our art section director, to our museum director, and make a case for it. And we have a conversation. We don't have a formal acquisitions board or committee that meets like twice a year. We do it on a case-by-case basis. So in some ways, it gives us the ability to be very flexible. It also means that we are kind of, well, I think it's a good thing. I don't know if there's really any bad part of it, but on a larger institution might have a different, idea about it. You probably would something to say about that as well too, because we have we're kind of maybe responding in the moment, but we try to look at it in terms of a larger picture of what we have in the collection, what it might mean. We have to ask another question of ourselves as well too, is if it's an artist who is not particularly well represented in an art historical context, exhibition history, might even be an amateur artist from southern or central Illinois, we have to look at it through some other measure of what is their personal history, what is the story behind them, does it have a context or a connection with something else within our collection, within the natural history realm or the anthropological realm. So these are the kind of things that we look at. But then when it comes to the physical, yes, we will take something and we make a determination, we'll take one piece or we'll take up to so many. It comes back to us. I'm doing the acquisition report. I'm probably picking the piece up.
Did you have gas to drive to?
Yeah, I mean,
Gas money to drive.
yeah,
to
so, yeah. I'm writing a really quick travel request to say, all right, in 3 weeks I need to rent a van so I can go pick this work up and buy some material, and so we do it all. Yeah.
There's two things that come to mind here. First of all, thank you, Governor Pritzker, for getting these back on track.
Yeah.
With the Illinois State Museum, they're in recovery.
Wait, can
From
I
our
interrupt
former
and
governor.
ask how many people have been to the Illinois State Museum in Springfield? In Springfield. Pretty good. That's
great,
not
thank
bad.
you.
Not the Abraham Lincoln Museum.
Illinois State Museum.
They have
Be very clear.
Yeah, our upstart cousins.
The second thing is that I think everyone that comes upon this collection, that's responsible for this collection, needs to understand you don't just pick up the phone and call these guys, call people in public collections. You need to research the person's work, figure out what their vitae is, if they were in any shows, develop the biography, photograph the work, catalog at least the highlights as you see them.
I hate to interrupt you, but
to give these guys an idea of what they're dealing with.
no, most people just pick up the phone and call.
Right, I know. But what I'm saying is, in order for you
Oh, you
to
shouldn't
be-
do that. Okay.
Right, yeah. You should prepare beforehand, before you try to contact these kinds of people. I think it's really important. Because first impressions mean a lot, and I get calls, I got a painting of a horse.
Oh, yeah, we get those as well, too.
You know, if the glass is broken, but the horse is still really pretty, you know? And what I usually say is, could you take a cell phone picture and email it to me? You know, that's really what it comes down to. Lynn, how does the MCA differ?
Well, the MCA differs quite a bit. We're not as grassroots, as the word that kept coming to mind when
Yeah.
you were talking. And we don't just collect Illinois, Chicago-based artists by any means. We're an international collection. But personally, having been there for so long, I tend to get those phone calls. And I have gotten quite a few actually from artist heirs over the years. And the MCA, it's very different. It has an acquisition committee. It's extremely regimented. We don't do cost-benefit analysis per se, but we do think of, first, does this work of art benefit the community? Will it be shown instead of just going straight to storage for decades? Yes, what are the costs of caretaking it, insuring it, and all those things that you've outlined. But it's generally, you don't dead call a museum of contemporary art, whether it's the MCA or any other major museum, saying, I've just inherited an artist's estate and can you help me with it? What has happened with the MCA mostly is people who are in the collection, the heirs find that out or know about that, and then they call and they say, you already have some of this artist's work, would you be interested in more? And they almost always want you to buy it. And that's the other issue with most museums. The acquisition funds are not for works out of estates of artists that are not very well known. And the major artists that you've been talking about with like the Joan Mitchell Foundation and the things that they go through, they're pretty well taken care of, and we're going to hear about that stuff. It's the artists that maybe are peripheral or had a career earlier and now aren't as well known. All those sorts of artists that an individual curator like Doug or myself may know about, but the rest of the establishment of the museum couldn't care less. So I just want to actually be a little specific about the MCA. We have gotten, I think, 2 or 3 artist bequests in our history. The most amazing one to me was Gertrude Abercrombie. When you guys were involved, the Illinois State Museum was involved with the heirs of Abercrombie, which was Don Baum,
Right.
and then later Don Baum's son, Timothy, who now kind of is in charge of the Gertrude Abercrombie estate, really wisely contacted people who kind of knew about this stuff and divided the estate amongst public institutions. And I was just talking to Doug earlier how suddenly, other people at the MCA, after decades of Gertrude Abercrombie scholarship and exhibitions, because of the show in New York at Karma,
Karma, yeah.
who's this Gertrude Abercrombie? So, okay, and then another artist estate that we got was Forrest Best. I think a lot of people know who that is now, but when we got that, it was a distribution from the estate. We didn't get the entire estate. We got, I don't know, over a dozen works. Now everybody is like crazy to get their hands on this stuff. So there have been a few really important bequests from artists and their heirs to the MCA, but it's gone through not like a dead call, for sure. It's working with the dealer, working with people who know, learning who are on the staff at the museums that you might be interested in. And I also wanted to talk about Ellen Lanyon, because that was a very interesting case of how she handled her estate. And you, or Dr. Sokol, I can't remember, touched on how much we might expect artists to really take care of their own inventories and document their own work and really prepare the work so that you understand the chronology and all these things. Ellen was the type of artist who really was on top of that, and she even went further to where I think she was maybe in her 70s. She actually took an inventory of everything she had and then contacted dozens of museums. I mean, you probably contacted the Illinois State Museum, but museums all over the country, university museums, major museums, MoMA, MCA, the whole range, and said, here's what I have. After my death, you will be contacted and asked to choose 4 things, and you will get 2 of them. So, you know, this was kind of an interesting way of going about it, because the work was diverse enough, because she started out in, there was works from the 40s up until almost the present day. There were prints, there were paintings, artist book kind of things. She contacted a wide enough range of museums that there was going to be specialized interest from various museums. Plus, she put you into competition with one another, even if not directly, just sort of psychologically. Oh, I really want this, but maybe MoMA wants it too, you know. It was actually an interesting strategy. Now, once she did pass away, which she was older, but it was a rather unexpected death, there was a huge burden on her heirs, of course, to carry out this plan, but this plan was in place. So when she passed away and the MCA was contacted, we had already sort of gone through the process of, yeah, these are the 4 works we're interested in. We just needed to report back and learn what 2 we were going to get. So that was an interesting thing too.
It's brilliant.
You get to choose 4, but you're only going to get 2, and you don't necessarily know which one you get.
Do you have any idea how many of the museums accepted the offer?
You know, maybe Doug remembers, I think it was like over 50 museums or something. And I think the majority of them did accept offers.
They really were able to disperse that estate. They had it was very well organized, and the arrangements with the museums, basically, I'm not 100% sure about this, had been made ahead of time. So,
Well, as I just said, they were sort of made ahead of time.
Yeah.
Like you get to choose, but you're not going to find out until later. So the one thing I did want to say, which Dr. Sokol really covered during his case study of Dick Higgins, is a lot of contemporary artists don't just make discrete objects. And I was in a very poignant situation, and I'll say her name, Esther Perrotta, who you probably knew very well.
yes.
After her very unfortunate early demise from this world, left everything kind of very undocumented. And she worked she was a photographer, but she worked in installation mode. So she would do these, she would go in, work with graduate students, do these really major installations, and maybe the graduate students took some notes, and maybe there were some documentary photos, but then it all ended back up at her studio in boxes and rolled up, and to decipher this stuff, to figure it out, was virtually impossible. So a lot of artists now, if you work in installation mode whatsoever, even doing a good documentation like you showed of John Miller's studio, it still isn't really enough. You gotta like do diagrams and sets of instructions. You gotta really, if you want this to ever be redone, this quote installation. Unless of course you're with a major gallery, then you can forget about all that. But if you're not, you have to have a little bit of imagination about your own work of, okay, you're there doing it all, but when you're gone, who's going to know how it's supposed to be? And that is, I think, something I've run into more recently, where it's sort of like, there's no way this can be passed along to anyone because there's not enough information about what it is supposed to be.
There's these cross sections of information,
Yeah.
and it's actually more like a weaving. You're trying to put threads back together. One of the things that Dr. Sokol
David's quite sufficient.
is he's a mensch. Was this idea of generating revenue, and I think it's important, to understand that this is a there's the market has all these levels to it. First choice most often should go to public collections because that's going to reinforce the value of any artist. And then perhaps select pieces, not the best, not the worst, should go at auction to generate revenue, to be able to catalog and insure and to move a marketing program along for the artist. And then what we're going to do with John's work is a series of open studios. Have people come into the studio. We have a time frame on this, probably a year from about now. All the material has to leave this because it's an estate that's entwined and the estate's going to be sold. And then there's the ephemera, which is a really important.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like which archives does the ephemera go to?
So he has incredible printed material from the late 1940s and 1950s about Momentum Gallery and the early art galleries in Chicago. Some of it's in really great condition, some of it's in poor condition.
You
So
know,
there's all these stages.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've sort of talked about tangentially, and I want to state really specifically, you have to spend money to make money on this artist estate thing. And often there isn't any money. And then it just gets worse and worse and stuff does end up getting out to the dumpster. It might, if you're really serious about placing an artist estate, you know, and preserving it, you do have to come to terms with the fact that you're gonna have to spend money.
Yeah, even just to spend the money to have someone come in and do the cataloging for you or do the inventory, which is really very key. It's become much easier in the digital age.
Right. Yeah.
And it's also become easier to share that information in the digital age, among many people. But that's just really key because one of the hardest things is to go into a studio or to a home and, go on a tour and look around and pull things off the wall, look on the back, look for a date or a title.
You have James do it
Or no, I mean, we all have been in this situation.
And I think,
And the ephemera, which often is the last thing that might get looked at, the archival material that an artist will save, is actually where, as we were talking earlier about your mom's work, about finding out the name of the model of a piece of some drawings that we received from Judith Ross' estate. I mean, that information can come later on, but it's just as important in some ways as the original material, because material will speak for itself on some aesthetic term, or we can interpret it in a larger way, but that archival material really fills a story. I mean, for an institution like us, we really want that archival material for that story. And there's a very brief case is William DeZiel, whose wife Elizabeth DeZiel ran Seaberg. Was an artist who really dropped out of the art world in the mid-70s, but had a pretty interesting career prior to that, from the 40s on up. And we received a painting from Elizabeth's estate, along with material from his notes from when he was a student at the school, some of his military records. The painting I selected was it was a very abstract piece that had reference to being a World War II bomber, one of the ball turrets of flying fortresses. So one of the things that we can do is get that information from the archives, but then it's public presentation, us doing a public presentation. I did a talk about his archives last week in Springfield and showed his military records, showed the painting, and there was a woman in the audience whose grandfather was a ball gunner, he was in the Army Air Corps, knew all the history, and was able to look at the painting and decipher the sort of the visual code of the painting for us. Information that I didn't have. So, putting that information then out into the public in a sort of crowdsourced way brought us information for our piece and institution that gives us the ability to take that painting and contextualize it in a World War II context, in a modernism context, in a local history, military context. A lot of stuff just came from that encounter. But it wouldn't have happened if I didn't have the painting with the documentation, and then to be able to put it out in the public in some way for someone to respond, to give me information I didn't have. None of us know everything.
Can I just say something?
Yeah.
Keith and I are spending some time right now at the Neumann estate trying to convince the grandchildren now, grandnephews of not to throw away all the records that I have over 35 years of dealers that are sometimes now out of business, and correspondence that I've had with other museums that had shows but didn't have shows. And they said, well, we're gonna ship it out, I'm sort of, retiring from this a little bit. They said, oh, we'll store it in Atlanta where one of the three grandnephews is. And just dump all the stuff we don't need. They said, I'm not dumping anything.
Right.
And you can dump it, maybe, I hope you don't, but that's your business, but I cannot in good conscience start getting rid of any of these records.
Well, and the important thing is provenance. And a lot of these records actually demonstrate provenance, which if you are going to go at auction, to have that provenance is really key information.
One thing I want to do through the gallery or through whatever nonprofits or community-based groups that are out there is to dispel the mystery around cataloging. I love it. I enjoy it. It's contemplative for me, but it's super easy now. You open up an Excel file, you have the fields, you take photographs, you associate the two things. You take notes on condition, any other interesting things. So I want to do cataloging workshops here in the gallery and hopefully develop a guide for that, because I think it's really important for heirs and executors to understand. And even if they want to hire a high school student or a graduate student to work on cataloging, they need to understand it themselves. It's a great way to
I've
get
hired
started.
many interns. I do a lot of cataloging. I was in charge of the artist book collection, and I'd hire interns to catalog. And I actually got to the point where I'd show them a ruler and say, do you know how to use this?
Right.
Seriously,
Yeah.
and
Isn't there an app for that?
isn't there an app or height, depth, width,
Yeah.
depth,
Yeah.
or just, the date. Get the date on there. So many things don't have dates. Anyway, sorry.
I think it's possible. I think there's certain people that are going to be really good at it and interested in it, and there's certain people who don't want to have anything to do with it. But we'll be reaching out to people to do that. I want to get to you. Jane is an example of someone who has done things really responsibly with the work of John Schacht. You want to tell us about
Yeah.
John?
So I had a friend, John Schacht, who was an artist. He didn't really have much of a career, but he showed his work from time to time. He was very prolific in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and he worked before that, but I didn't know him before the 70s. And I didn't like all of his work, but I liked his work. He wasn't really part of the artistic community. He was almost an outsider artist, but not really. He's self-educated. He didn't finish high school, but he was very smart. He was well read.
He was part of the queer diaspora too.
He had. We got him a show at Iceberg Project. C.C. McKee did it, and my assistant Dan, who's back there, introduced me to C.C. McKee, and so we got an exhibition, and it was written about by Michel. Give me his last name. What? Segar. Thank you. And he really wrote about it in the context of its being gay art, and he compared him to somebody who was working today, who today the culture is completely different and people are out in the way they weren't before. So John was somebody who allegedly wasn't out. Anybody who knew him knew he was gay, but it's not something he published. And the work that he exhibited previously to his death very rarely had the more erotic and ambiguous gender drawings, etc. So it's interesting because when you say that, that's not exactly how he presented himself, even though that made up a large portion of his work. Anyway, he died fairly suddenly, and he was in Leon, Iowa, and I felt very strongly that his work was going to just be thrown out, as well as his collections. He lived many places when I knew him. Every place he lived was really like an art piece. He made his homes very wonderful. So a friend of mine and I drove to Leon, Iowa in the middle of the winter to, you could say, scavenge his work. We knew who the executor is. There's a long story to this you don't need to know, but we went out there and I went in a station wagon. We took everything we could. There was no heat, no electricity, no running water. So we could only work during daylight. It was in February. It must have been 15 degrees out. It was really, we were there for about 2.5 days. We took what we could and we organized things. And we brought it back. And I had an attic in the building next door to me. And it all went up there. And then I went back another time and I got the rest. And I thought, well, wait a minute. I don't really own this work.
Good point.
Yeah, so it's like, in a way you could say I stole the work. So that's not true, but, the executor gave me the keys and et cetera, et cetera. She knew nothing about art. She was sure somebody would take it. And so anyway, that's the beginning, that I got the work and I didn't own it. And I have a friend who's a lawyer and he wrote something up and the executor signed it, so it became mine. And I have to tell you, I didn't think about copyright until more than a year later, because I was thinking, how can I exhibit the work, or even to sell it, which I have not wanted to sell, and I'll explain that also. I mean, I don't need the money and I don't care about that. But if I were to sell work, what would happen? The best work would go right away. And then what would happen with the estate? And I feel like you've sort of touched on that with the
So
idea.
your emphasis is public collections and exhibiting.
My exhibiting the work, because I feel you have to position yourself or whoever you're working with to be attractive to a collection, and that's not going to happen if you don't exhibit the work. And if it's not written about, it's like if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears this. So anyway, that's what we're trying to do now. In the meantime, not knowing how to do anything, I knew that the work had to be photographed and that we had to catalog it in some way. And it's funny because you showed a spreadsheet, which Dan has done. A spreadsheet. Tom Van Endy, I don't know if you know him.
Photographer, right?
Yes.
I have 3 of his photographs.
Yes, well, he's a photographer and he's a photographer. So for a living, he photographs people's work. As a favor to me, he photographed most of the work in this archive, which was fabulous. And
How many pieces are there?
About 800 that are documented.
Yes, but,
John Miller is probably around 4,000,
right.
4,500.
And out of 800, I've been thinking about, you talk about destroying stuff ahead of time, I have lots of thoughts about that. So I just thought I would show this. The way we did it is we put together, I wanted to do this. Dan did it all online. I'm an analog person. I don't really understand anything about computers. I'm a real estate broker, so I have to understand enough to do that. But so I had to have a printed copy, and I have a big loose leaf binder. You could pass this around if you want. I just took one and made a Xerox of it. So, but we tried to get the information that we thought was important on it.
And actually, let me interrupt, and this is a good interruption for both what you mentioned and what you're talking about. Spreadsheets are fine. Auction people, curators, anyone is going to want to see a big image. And it's hard to pull them out of spreadsheets and blow them up. They're never good. So this kind of thing for marketing to auction houses or curators is much superior to just sending them a spreadsheet. Sorry, go ahead.
Anyway,
Individual photographs.
Yes,
Yeah.
that you can really see. that
With
can
the
blow up.
information, with the
Yeah.
photograph.
There's a lot of products out there. The galleries, you can subscribe or you can purchase the software or do a subscription. that do all of these things. There's also these root programs like Excel, and now you're almost able to do this thing with images where you click on the images, and there's Airtable and other ones. It's
Yeah,
worth
Airtable I use.
it's it's worth investigating these different softwares. I'm sorry.
Anyway, it's very important to have good photographs. So Tom Van Endy was perfect. In the beginning, people donated their time, but eventually they stopped working on it. So here's something I did, and I think this is interesting. You're saying, don't cold call. I cold call everybody. And it's the way I've always
you cold
done
call me?
everything.
But we're
I
friends.
did, that's right.
But you didn't cold call me.
No, but I'm
Tomorrow.
going to.
I saw the show at Iceberg, it was fantastic.
Oh, thank you, that's
Yeah,
great.
I know, it's a great show.
Thanks, that was John's work.
Yeah.
So I want to archive my own work. John's my test case. He died 10 years ago. So this is a very slow process because I don't do it for very long periods of time. I don't want to do what I call the donkey work. And the donkey work is oh so much of the work. It's getting all the information, cataloging it. And now I pay people to work on it, and over 10 years, if you include everything, including buying flat files for the work, I have I don't know how much money I have, but I have somewhere over $13,000 in it, and probably over $15,000 in it, right. So, and I don't mind doing that, I have it, I can do it. So, we're kind of bumbling our way through it. I really didn't read anything about it. I knew the work had to be photographed. I knew it really had to be cataloged. And Tom had already made photographs for me, and not knowing how to do anything, I managed to do a CD, is that what it is? With 20 images on it. And I showed it to people, and I had people who were really interested in the work, and I never followed through because it wasn't cataloged. And now it's years later, and I don't have quite the impetus to be doing that in the same way. And I know I have to get back into doing that. So John did some exhibiting when he was alive, but after he died, I got a show at the Knockdown Center in just outside of Long Island City. And it's a venue in New York that's become known as a venue, and it was written about. So we were very lucky that way. It was a two-person show. And then C.C. McKee came along because Dan knew him and contacted him. He was immediately interested in the work. He said he would like to curate a show, and that happened at Iceberg Projects. So, and that was written about. And one of the things that was interesting for me is Michelle Segar wrote an article about it, and it made me look at John's work with different eyes, and that was a terrific thing for me. One of the wonderful things about archiving work is you actually look at every piece, and if you go through the papers and other things, you learn things about your friend or your
Family member.
whoever, things that you didn't know. In fact, if you have if your parents die and you go through whatever they have, and you look at everything, you learn a lot about them that you never knew before.
And some things you don't want to know.
I want to know everything.
I wanted to back up a little bit, though, Jane, and talk about copyright.
Okay, all right.
These guides, which will have links, actually the foundation, the Joe Mitchell Foundation and the Pittsburgh Arts Foundation, or Arts Council, have links on their websites. You can download the full PDFs on artist estates and dealing with artist estates, have extensive sections on copyright.
And I actually...
But how did you handle it?
So, we were having a discussion about if we had a show and we were to do a catalog or something like that, and all of a sudden it was like, boom, copyright. I didn't have that. So this is more than a year after he's died. I don't know if the estate has been quote settled. It's not like he had so much, he really didn't. He had wonderful collections, and I have a lot of that also. And I just like freaked out. So I called the executor, who told me that they were closing the estate in 2 days. So I went to Lawyers for the Creative Arts, and if you don't know them, you should know them. They're fantastic. And Bill was still alive, and he was there, and
Bill,
who started it? I
oh, right, Bill, yeah, okay, yeah.
Bill.
Marcy Rolnick is taking over, but, yeah, I
Why
know
can't I
it.
think of his name?
Yeah.
He started it. I just-
Ratner, Bill
Ratner.
Ratner.
So my memory's going away, so.
If anybody has taxable deductions, it's a great organization to support because they help
They help
people.
artists.
Yeah.
So, so it was like the end of the day, and I called, I found out when they opened. I'm very aggressive when I need to do something. I just go there. I'm there. I'm on the steps before they open the next morning. And I went in and I said, I have this situation, and I explained the situation. They were interested in it. That was wonderful. And Bill Ratner talked to me, and he assigned somebody to work on it. And then after that person worked on it, it went to him, and he actually, redid it. And
Was it filed with the estate? Or?
I sent it. So I called the executor. I said, I'm going to email this to you. I would like you to print it out, sign it, scan it, email it back, have it notarized by the lawyer who's doing the estate, and snail mail me back an original, and that's what she did, and I got it. And it's like, in 10 minutes we're closing. That estate's gone. So that was very lucky. So I'm in the position now, I feel. I mean, I want his work to go to an institution. There are people who have wanted to buy pieces, and I haven't done that. I have never gone back to the people who were really interested in the work before. Some of them were gallerists. And I am reluctant to sell for the reason I just said. I'm not in it for the money. I want his work to go somewhere. I don't want it to be thrown out. And I don't really know what's going to happen.
Have you made arrangements? Is it safe if you pass away? God forbid?
No, absolutely not. And neither is my work. This is like the prelude for me to do it for myself. No, I don't.
The cobbler's children go barefoot.
No, and in fact, so I read this whole thing, the Joan Mitchell thing for artists. It's called, you can look at it if you want. This one was Estate Planning Workbook for Visual Artists. And I shouldn't say this, but I found it to be very discouraging.
It is.
There is so much work involved that it's unbelievable. And copyright, I thought I knew a lot about copyright, but it turns out I don't know as much as I thought I did. I think you're protected if you're copyrighted, but I don't think you can sue someone for use if you have not recorded the copyright. And
No,
it's,
that's only prior to a certain date. I think it's the mid-70s to current time, you don't have to record copyright. You automatically have
Artists
copyright.
hold copyright.
Can you speak to Artist Rights Society a little bit?
Well, Artist Rights Society is a company, basically, where whoever, the artist or their heirs or estate, actually job out the copyright duties
it's
to
called artists.
artists'
ARS,
rights
yeah.
estate.
They have over, I mean, they have everybody.
You see it a lot with
Picasso.
major artists where if things are being reproduced all over the place, the Artists' Rights Society not only sells the rights, but will go after people who haven't gotten the rights. For most artists, that's not something you're gonna have to deal with. But understanding the copyright is for artists, creators. I don't know the exact date. It's the mid-70s. Do you know the exact date? 77 or
I
something?
think it's 77.
There was a law passed where you no longer have to like put circle copyright on the back of your work or send it to the copyright office. You as the artist automatically hold the copyright. For earlier work, then that's a different issue.
And it's up through your death and then I think 70 years after.
70 years after.
After.
And your heirs automatically get the copyright.
Copyright.
But it's, in general, this is an interesting area, and it's really important, I think, to nail down roles and responsibilities within a family, for instance, and ownership, and then distribution, how that's going to work as well. And there's very, really positive tax benefits, and there's positive things to knowing a tax lawyer, first of all, in all of this. For instance, collectors can own a great work of art and do incremental gifts to a nonprofit institution, keep the work for their entire lifetime, but take off 10% of its value every year from their taxes over 10 years.
Well, that
And
that
artists
works,
and
that works
estates-
if an artist is well known.
Right,
I mean, we
right.
really are talking about two things that are so different
Yeah.
that it's unbelievable. I mean,
Yeah.
if you're talking about somebody who's well known, that person has
Right.
a venue or a way to be able to
Right.
ultimately be in a collection or a series
Right.
of collections. But if you're not well known, you don't have that. And actually, you brought up Gertrude Abercrombie and
Forest Bits.
yes, and when those works were given to you, you correct me if I'm wrong because I actually don't know. That was before Abercrombie I'm talking about was well known, wasn't
She
it?
was actually pretty well known in Chicago amongst, artists
Well,
and
yes,
patrons,
but-
but in the larger art world, no.
No.
I mean,
That
didn't
gift
Jim
was
Faulkner? Wasn't Jim Faulkner?
I don't know if Jim.
No,
It was
that-
Don Bob.
It was Don
Oh,
Bowne,
Don
and
Bowne.
it was Don Bowne and her last husband, whose name is spacing out, who died. So it was Frank Sandiford and Carl Creedy were the three executors, but all those two, Sandiford and Creedy, died prior to Abercrombie. So it was just left to Bowne, which was good because I think Abercrombie was buying work back
So
before. So she had set this up, but Bowne saw the importance of, Sandiford probably would have sold the work out for money. So it was good that it was just Don Bowne. But that was 1977, and we received like 68 pieces from that estate, along with others. And a lot of them are just like study sketches and real
but that's
stuff.
fine.
But it was outside of Chicago that wasn't known. And we did that exhibition in 91 or 93. And we were buying work literally over the desk. People would come in and say, well,
I found this in a
yeah,
thrift shop.
it was a couple of $100 for a piece here or there,
Yeah.
that day. But now it's a ridiculous market and it's flooded with fakes. So there's another aspect to it as well too. And the other problem with Abercrombie is the copyright has not really been established. The Smithsonian listed it for a long time as copyright undetermined.
Yeah, we have problems every time people want to reproduce our actors. I'm like, Timothy Baum, maybe? No,
Yeah, I didn't even have his name
Yeah.
for that.
So
So
the copyright turns out to be important. But I want to
that's because it's becoming an issue. It wasn't an issue 20 years ago as much as it is now.
But it's worth stuff now.
But it is, yeah.
Successful artists.
I want to make the comment about you don't just go there, present yourself to somebody. I don't agree with that because if you talk to people who maybe they're good artists, maybe they're not, but they're not able to get their work out. It's like you tell yourself no before someone else says no to you. you do it the way you're supposed to do it, whatever that is, send stuff via email along with 50,000 other people who are sending stuff via email. I have my own way that I do
Well,
it.
yeah,
I
but-
try to make contact with somebody whose no means something rather than the palace guards who will always say no. So, you know.
Well, that's a good point, but someone just showed up at the MCA recently and was actually escorted out via security because they were.
Was that you?
No, it wasn't
No.
Jane.
You have to,
So you have to be careful.
you have to do it in a way, I mean,
It's not being
you don't want to
practical.
alienate.
I actually, Jane, I have to tell you, I think that we need to respect them as professionals
I'm not saying not to.
and present things in a way where they can actually, you know.
Yeah, but
absorb them.
on a weekly basis, or our main museum is in Springfield, we're also a decorative arts, natural history, whatever. Weekly, people show up at our museum and not only just say, I wanted to speak to somebody, they leave stuff
They have
at
the
front
artworks
desk.
with them, yeah.
You know, people, paintings,
Yeah, we get
quilts,
stuff like-
you know, donation, I mean, just
Mail
anything,
stuff
rocks.
to
You
us,
know, I mean, because we're a geology collection.
There's a Tolly monster in that rock.
Yeah.
You know what I-
But weekly, our curators are down there, are coming down to meet someone who just walked off the street. And they will do it. And sometimes it's really worthwhile, and sometimes it's, you
Yeah,
know,
I don't think it's the ideal
No.
situation. I would never recommend it. I do want to open up things to
Yeah,
questions
yeah.
because we've got a time
Okay.
limit on the lecture. And so does anyone have any questions? Yes, sir, you were first.
I think the idea that it's two separate things, that we're talking about successful artists. So the Joe Mitchell Foundation assumes a certain amount of success.
Have you read it?
Yes, I have.
Okay.
I worked with Barbara Crane. I was also Harold Allen's executor, his estate, way back when Harold passed away. So, yeah, I've read all this. And it applies to a very certain type of artist that has a commercial viability. But then, like, you know, I knew John for a long time. And John, at some point, kind of no longer pursued a career in terms of a commercial career. He made a lot of art.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes his issue. I mean, the monetary issue is huge. To catalog John's work,
Yes, I
to
agree
catalog,
with
Len
that.
and I are trying to catalog Barbara Crane's work. It's phenomenal. Like, it's a mountain.
She was very prolific
No.
as well.
It's one of the investments that galleries make, a commercial gallery. That's what I feel like this is. I'm at about 500 pieces at this point, I've cataloged, photographed and cataloged. And it's one of the investments that the gallery makes and that museums make as well. And so for the foreseeable future, what I see is any sales, that money is going back to basically just pay for
Right.
this process for the foreseeable future. You know, we price things really low prices, folks. There's a price list right over here, by the way, we're a retail gallery. And
I want to mention two other.
yeah, and so the idea is that there's this economy of scale. We're getting the things out there because he didn't hustle. He wasn't like Barbara. He wasn't interested in really selling his work all the time. So we're getting the work out there right now. People are starting to talk about it, and we're also being careful about what we show and what we sell. And we'll get around to doing a full catalog raisonné at some point. So,
It's very difficult.
Having done a catalog raisonné, good luck.
I want to mention two things that you might look at, and I have a couple. I put out about 8 or 10 of these that you could take. But one is a story of someone who, Maggie Phillips, and I'm sure many of you knew her. So Maggie Phillips apparently decided she wanted, and anyone can correct me, that she wanted to donate her building that she owned and her artwork to the Art Institute, and they turned her down. I don't think she expected that, but I don't.
The school. It's got to be.
Was it the school?
It's gotta be the school.
Okay. all right.
Lisa Stone wanted to be here. She had a long-term commitment. She's in Mississippi this weekend, but she's the curator of the Roger.
Yes, I know.
Roger
So-
Stone Study
So there
Collection.
was an article in the Reader, and it's worth reading, because what she did instead is she She had many very close friends. I didn't know her. I heard this story from Mel Theobald, who is intimately involved in the situation. So she invited 12 of her friends who are artists and asked, I think it's 12, and asked each of them to choose a person who was an artist who wasn't related to them or whatever, that that person thought had merit to receive a grant. And they had to say why they were receiving, they chose that person. So each person chose somebody else that couldn't be related, whatever. And when she died and the house sold, they each got basically a grant. And then apparently they had a sale of her artwork. They didn't know what to do with her stuff. All the stuff left in the house. So they did a house sale. They used the mailing list from her address book, invited everyone to come. I think they probably sold it for whatever anyone wanted to offer. They sold almost everything, and that money also went to the grants and also to produce a limited edition catalog, cataloging this process. So I mention it because I think it's a fabulous thing for someone to have done. Yeah, I know Judy, and Barbara Crane's the person who chose Judy. So that, I mean, it's really, that's a terrific story. And then the other one is Vivian Maier. So I have a whole lot, millions of thoughts about Vivian Maier and who she was as a photographer and how she's become, quote, the photographer or artist that she's thought of or known as of today, and which is a discussion not to get into. But it has to do with positioning. So the person who found her work, and some people don't think that...
There were 3 people.
Yes. So there are people who think they don't deserve to have that work, but that work would not exist if those people hadn't found it and one way or another put it out. That's work that would have been thrown out. And, you know, there's that expression, you can't, I don't want it, you can't have it. I don't, you know, it's like, maybe it's some kind of jealousy or whatever that is, but someone becomes famous and like, how did you get it? So positioning is a very important thing in terms of archiving work.
Positioning is so hard to control.
But yes, but I think
You can't
The thing-
plan for stuff like that.
But Vivian Maier, I think that, like John Maloof positioned her ultimately.
Slattery did too. They were working on different
Yes,
levels of the
anyway, so
marketplace.
those are the 2 stories.
You want to get into questions?
Here.
Yes, ma'am.
When Ellen Lanyon contacted 50 museums, how was she able to get through to somebody that could decide without having her email deleted?
You know, she was friends with so many people. She had so many personal contacts that I don't think these things just went to some random name.
So she knew who
Yeah,
to
she
show.
made
And she was known.
relationships.
She was already
She was known
known.
by the establishment of the museums and the College Art Association.
And I have to
and
tell,
everything.
I have to tell you, if you're not in that group, it's gotten pretty opaque. Museums have gotten pretty good at keeping you from getting to the curators.
Yeah, because
and-
they're overwhelmed.
Yeah. Well, it's just yeah.
See,
Go on
the
go on the
problem-
websites of some of the major museums and you cannot find the names of the curators.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah,
the staff is not on the website.
Yeah.
Well, there will be junior staff, but no, not the name of the curator, and
Yeah.
certainly no contact information.
So the moral to that story is take advantage of when you are alive, the contacts that you make, and make sure that there's a link there, you know, it's a secure link into the future.